And you know what I find about God? He doesn't treat the Jewish children any more special than he treats the Gentile children who believe in Christ. In fact, the book of Acts, the early church, the problem they had was really a step-parent problem. I don't know if you realize it. This was the problem, is how do we bring in these Gentiles? We need them to look more like us Jews. We need them to go through circumcision, to obey certain laws. We need them to be more like us before we will accept them. But Peter has an epiphany. He has a vision. He goes to the house of Cornelius, a Gentile man, and he preaches the gospel to his whole family, and the whole family gets converted. And right then, when he sees this whole family come to Christ, they're not Jews, they're not his brothers, it hits him. Peter mentions in Acts 10:34, then Peter began to speak, I now realize how true it is that God does not, what does it say? Does not show favoritism. You want to know the way God acts? He shows no favoritism. Whether they're Gentiles who came in after the Jews or the Jews who were there with them from the beginning. You know what God says? Peter says, it hit me. God shows no favoritism. He accepts everyone who repents and makes Jesus Lord of their life. And so when I see this, I recognize that even though Peter and the apostles that were Jews had trouble not showing favoritism, Peter hit him. It hit him. God doesn't. So if God doesn't, I shouldn't either. So you know what the lesson I think is? Is that we got to work so extra hard to make sure we don't show favoritism for our children and show discrimination toward our stepchildren. And it is so subtle, it is so easy to do this. Because naturally you are attracted to your own children that you've known from birth. They are flesh and blood, and it's so easy to push away your stepchildren. And you might even do it unconsciously. But you do it nevertheless. Now, I'm a stepson. Red has been my stepfather for almost my entire life. But one of the things my sister and I always felt from my stepfather is we didn't feel like second-class citizens with him. He did not make my sister and I feel like unwanted and that he favored his own son and daughter. Was there an inclination for him to love his own son and daughter more than us? Absolutely. Maybe he did, but I did know this. He never made us feel that way. Now, I'm going to tell you the truth, though. It doesn't mean that they didn't show favoritism. I remember, maybe Red wasn't showing favoritism, but my mom, she would show favoritism toward my sister and I. I remember they would get, the few fights that I would hear them get into, I would hear my mom take my sister and I's side and say, you're and I remember hearing that, and I can remember a few times thinking, we're not that good, Mom. I remember thinking that. We're not that good. I know you're making us out to be saints, but it's not really like that. You don't quite get it. Because, if we ever got into a fight, immediately my mom would take my sister and I's side. Just the natural. What I'm saying is, I did see this, all right? And it is possible, but overall, they worked at making sure everyone was included. And to this day, my stepbrother and stepsister, especially my stepsister, absolutely loves my mom. And I don't know how many times she just come over and just slept over, and they would cuddle in the bed together, and they would have popcorn, and they'd watch movies together. That's the way my mom made my stepsister feel. And that's what I'm saying is the reason why all four of us turned out well, all four of us are homeowners. We all do really well financially. We're all professionals in our field, either entrepreneurs or making good money, all of us. And yet none of us had the traditional mom and dad, biological mom and dad. We did all right. And it shows that even if you have stepchildren, they can still turn out to be good people. But the issue is, are you going to be that good parent, step-parent, that makes that stepchild feel wanted and included? I think of another story that really touched me. Story of David. Now, David had a son named Absalom. Now, Absalom was his favorite son. He was the best looking of all the kids. He was also the smartest. How many of y'all know if you get good looks and brains together, that's a miracle? So if you're good looking, just cover your head. Oh, God, help me. But, and you know, it was a difficult thing. I mean, he loved him with more than anyone. Because, and he had incredible leadership skills. He was a very successful guy. Well, one day, though, despite how wonderful his son was, there was a character flaw that he had. He had some pride in his heart, and he wanted the throne of his father David. And suddenly, he began to turn people's hearts away from his father and get them to turn toward him. He wanted to be king. And eventually, when he felt like he had a sizable majority now on his side, Absalom went on a coup to overthrow his father David. And David, knowing the coup was underway, took all of his men and they ran out of the palace, and Absalom took over the palace, hailing himself as the new king. Well, the fight wasn't over. David was still determined to fight back, but he told all the men, now we're going to fight, we're going to try to win if God's on our side. However, not one of you better hurt my son Absalom. Is that clear? So they said, we understand that. Well, on a freak accident, Absalom is going through the jungle and his thick hair gets caught up in some branches and he gets hanging there. And one of David's men finishes the job and kills Absalom. And they give word to David, good news, David, God has avenged your enemies. And the first thing David says is, he doesn't say, how many men have I lost? How many men? And the Bible tells him he lost thousands of men on both sides of the battle. He doesn't ask, how many men did I lose? He said, how's my son Absalom? A second man steps up and says, God has dealt with your enemy, David. He's dead. And right then, David weeps. And he begins to cry, oh, Absalom! Oh, Absalom! Why couldn't it have been me? Absalom! And he begins to weep. And the people see him weeping, calling out the name Absalom. And yet those people remembered they have John and Jim and Raul. There were some Mexicans in there. And they didn't hear him crying out the names of the fathers that just died in battle. They didn't hear the names of their brother that just died in battle. They heard, Absalom, Absalom, Absalom! And Joab, who was a prophet and a counselor to David, walks into David's palace and says, you better shut up, David! I can't believe you're weeping over your flesh and blood when he turned against you. But do you weep for your other children that died for you? Do you call out their name? David, you love the one who hated you, and you hate the ones who loved you. David, if you don't stop weeping for Absalom, you will discourage all of your other children. Get up, wipe your face, and stand before the people and tell them how much you appreciate and love what they did for you. And David just did that. He wiped his tears. He knew Joab was right, and he stood before the people and got the favor back again. Now, I bring this story up because I think it relates so much for biological children and stepchildren. Is David showed favoritism toward a son who wasn't deserving of it, but toward the Cinderellas, those with integrity, he pushed away. Do you see the lesson here? Is what are you really doing with your children? Do you cry out for your biological children? Absalom, Absalom. But your stepchildren don't hear that same compassion and love for them? That's wrong.